All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 22, Section 5, The Limits of Industrialization Outside the West. So in terms of geography, right, where we're talking about, the Industrial Revolution had its origins in Great Britain, but then spread to West and Northern Europe. And the countries we're mainly referring to are, countries like Germany, France, though it took a little while to get to France, Netherlands, and also we'll add the United States. So, somewhere by, we'll say roughly 1800 to about 1850, the industrial process was making itself very familiar in all of these areas. However, outside of the West, right, if we're going to look outside of Europe mostly, and the United States, which we sometimes consider to be the West also, industrialization had its limits. It did not flourish in other parts of the world, at least early on, as it did in some of these particular areas. And we're just going to focus on Egypt, India, and China, and just say a few things about how industrialization was played out in those areas. So in Egypt, there you had a ruler named Muhammad Ali, so we'll call him Egyptian ruler. And he adopted industrial technology, wanting to build Egypt into a technological powerhouse, much like the British had did in some of these other nations here. However, Egypt at the time was in a conflict or rivalry with the Ottoman Empire. In fact, one of the reasons why Muhammad Ali wanted industrial technology was to escape the power of the Ottoman Sultan. However, in 1839, Egypt went to war with the Ottomans and lost this war, and as a result had to enact free trade policies. Free trade policies put Egypt at a disadvantage. And this is going to be a common feature, really, in a lot of areas, really trying to catch up when it came to industrialization. And what this free trade policies pretty much allowed for was that British cloth pretty much flooded Egypt market. So we'll say British cloth flooded Egyptian markets. And because the British had a longer history of industrialization, they had more sophisticated machinery, they could produce their cloth for a lot cheaper, maybe a $1 sign, whereas the Egyptians, still kind of in the early phases of industrialization, could only produce cotton for maybe $3 or textiles for $3 signs. And so the effect that this had was it really destroyed a lot of the domestic economy, and the British kind of took advantage of that situation. A pretty similar thing happened in India. There it was the British East India Company, especially very early on, which controlled almost all, but at least much of Indian trade. Recall that the Mughal Empire in India really only relegated itself to the northern part. A lot of the southern tip was outside of Mughal control, and the British East India Company established trading relations with various local rulers in that area. And much like in Egypt, British textiles put Indian textiles out of business. So again, kind of the idea of British goods flooding the market into India. And so instead of India being a source of exporting trade goods, which historically it was, especially things like spices, instead India was transformed in an area to produce raw materials, namely cotton. Right? And so this created somewhat of an interdependence where on the one hand you had India, which produced cotton, Britain, right, which had the factory, And so India would ship the cotton to Britain, right? Again, very cheap. Britain would then turn that cotton into a finished good, which could sell back to India, right? We might put $4 signs here. And so that profit, right, of selling it and creating it went to the British side, whereas India didn't really get to benefit, at least from the profit. The benefit that India got was that it received cheap textiles. It could purchase those for a cheaper price, but it created a system of dependence. And with this relationship of India providing Great Britain with the raw materials, railroads, telegraphs, various infrastructure, was created by the British to what we might say, we'll just say further profit. All right, so the British did invest in India, but it invested in a way in which kept this system of dependence turning. In China, things were a little bit different because the Qing dynasty in China was a lot more powerful. For the most part, the Qing dynasty had relegated and really struck down any effort by Europeans to increase trade or increase economic activity. Recall the Macartney Mission and Great Britain's effort to try and open up Chinese markets to sell opium and tea and other goods to the Chinese. And the Qing dynasty turned them down. It said that they could only trade in specific cities like Canton. But the Chinese were slow or really didn't have a purpose for adopting industrial technology. There was always the idea of Confucianism, which influenced Chinese philosophy. Confucianism for a very long time was very much suspicious of outsiders, believing that the outside world had nothing of value to offer. That turned out to be wrong in the case of industrial technology. China was mostly agrarian, meaning mostly farming. And because it didn't have the same motives, right? For example, in China, inexpensive labor, no markets, and lack of trade really meant no immediate incentive to industrialize. Remember, when it comes to the Industrial Revolution, when it comes to actually building this factory, a lot of conditions need to be met. So in China, we could say that there were not as much of a need for technology. Why build a factory if, for example, there's no market, right? That means limited buyers. Where there's no expansive trade systems, right? Like the British had in the colonies in India and everywhere else. Inexpensive labor, because the factory mostly is labor-saving technology. You get more bang for your buck. Well, China, with a very large population, didn't necessarily have the same motives. Instead, China was much more concerned with social harmony, right? That is creating a peaceful society. And again, social harmony is the key tenet of Confucianism. That is the purpose. So Chinese politics, laws, regulations were all dedicated to this notion of trying to create a more harmonious society, not necessarily trying to create a society that was the most technologically superior or creating a society that could go out and conquer everyone else or make the most amount of money or hoard the most amount of wealth. And this came to this sort of difference between the industrial and non-industrial world came to a very clear consensus when the Nemesis, this was a British iron, steam-powered ship, sailed up Chinese rivers and took control. And China had nothing to stop it. First of all, the fact that a ship could sail up a river is not possible without industrial technology. And the fact that it was iron meant that any effort to try and destroy the ship, whether it was shooting cannonballs at it or bow and arrows or whatever it was, it simply just bounced off the hull. And it proves to be sort of a very, very stark contrast when you recall 1790, I want to say 1794, right? That's when the Macartney mission took place, in which China rejected Great Britain's offer, or at least suggestion, that they ought to open up. Now you move about to the 1830s, to the 1840s, and the tide is turned, right? Now where the British are dictating terms to China. So This instance only goes to show just how valuable this industrial technology was, because it completely shifts the global balance of power in favor of those nations who adopted industrial technology and adopted it the earliest. The British, the Germans, the French, the Dutch, and the United States become major global powers as a result.